Okay, cool. So let's start off with the classical narrative. Now, you began off the article with an example with 9/11 and then some nobody, right? I don't like to mention his name because he's a nobody. Basically saying, well, this attack happened because of, people, Islam losing its way because it had this golden age, and then the golden age was challenged by one guy, Imam Ghazali, and then Imam Ghazali led to the downfall, and therefore Muslims became basically anti-scientific. So this thing is known as the classical narrative, and it's repeated by Weinberg, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and others. So the first thing I want you to sort of explain to the viewers is, what's the origin of this idea, and why did it become so dominant?
Well, to be concise, it's basically a view that was adopted um, by another narrative discussing the dark ages of Christian civilization during a time when religion, so-called religion, had been the dominant ideology. Therefore, Christians could not succeed. It's largely invented from the Enlightenment period to sort of demean religious people, religious thinking, to assert that institutionalized religion was the primary reason behind scientific decline or scientific stagnation. And so, because of the European experience, which by the way is also quite skewed, they sort of just projected that onto the Muslims. So they had this theory in mind that, oh well, religion's bad, so we're going to assume that the reason that Muslims lost their way is because of becoming too religious as well. And then they just sort of found pieces of a puzzle to fit into that little theory and sort of discarded everything else that ignored it. And it was very popular for some time because you also had a lot of Muslim academics who were not actually attempting to address this issue, which is, I think, it's our fault, obviously. And so it kind of went wild for a while. And then only until like the past 15 years or maybe more, maybe almost 2 decades, have there been academics, still non-Muslim, by the way, but who have been coming out saying, no, this is wrong. So, yeah.
What's interesting about this classical narrative, as you're probably aware, is that even some Muslims have repeated it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's really surprising. And I was speaking to Dr. Shoaib Ahmed Malik, who obviously has done a lot of work with Imam Ghazali and his narrative and metaphysics and stuff. And he was saying even people who are actually from the Islamic classical tradition and scholars have actually repeated this type of thing. And that's really surprising because obviously it shows that it's gone full circle. It's a Enlightenment child, which then through colonization and westernization and secularization has become instilled as part of even the narrative that Muslims hold on to. So let's break this narrative down. Okay, so what are some of the reasons why we can basically see straight off the bat that this narrative doesn't really hold?
Well, a number of reasons. So, for example, one of the focuses of this narrative are the Mu'tazila. So essentially, they assert that these individuals, the rationalists, were the reasons why the Golden Age started, and because they were non-religious or anti-religious in their thinking. But this is problematic for a number of reasons. For number one, the Golden Age started prior to the rise of the Mu'tazila. It started during the Arab translation movements facilitated by the Umayyad Caliphate. Okay, during a time, initially, basically, right after the Islamic Empire started to establish itself, the moment it started conquering is when Muslims started translating Greek text in science. Now, this is significant because you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with anything? How does that have to do with the Golden Age? How is that showcasing scientific thinking? Well, the fact that the Muslims already knew that there was value in these books indicates a scientific mindset was already present. Is also evidence against the narrative that Muslims necessarily read science into the Quran, because if they did, they wouldn't feel the necessity to translate these works.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, they would just look at the Quran and be like, well, it's in there, so why do we have to read what the Greeks said? Likewise, the Mu'tazila, even when they became prominent, let's say they started ruling the caliphate, right? They only lasted like 33 years until they were ousted by more orthodox elements. In fact, the vast majority of scholars refuted them within a matter of decades, and the golden age lasted until like the 1600s. So they weren't even doing anything. They weren't the facilitators of the golden age, nor were they weren't even the initial like nothing. The golden age did not occur because of the Mu'tazila. That's basically it.
Yeah.
So that would be the first two things I would say. And did you want me to go through all the factors as to why that's problematic, or?
I wanted you to just briefly go over each one of them, but just as you just finished off this part here, one of the contentions which Hood Boy makes, oops, said his name, and others have made, is that even if we look at the main figures, right, if they were Mu'tazilites, they were definitely heretics. So if anybody did anything good, or there was a major figure within the Islamic Golden Age, they were most likely some sort of heretic. So how would you respond to that?
Well, that's nonsensical. I mean, so for example, when you look at the way that Islamic scientific productivity or Islamic scientific civilization actually function, and is that what they would do is that Orthodox Muslims, would look at Greek text, and they would modify what they felt was not in accordance with religion. Okay, this is normal for whatever paradigm you come from. You're going to discard certain things that you don't agree with and use other things and maybe even modify them, right? And this is actually what Muslims largely did, especially with astronomy. So, for example, when it came to Greek text, they would sort of discard the philosophical assumptions that many of the Greeks made with respect, because for a lot of you who don't know, back then philosophy and science were unified. Okay, so when a philosopher said natural science, they referred to the physical sciences, but they also combined metaphysics with that. Okay, which is one of the we'll get to Ghazali in a minute.
Yeah.
But this is one of the things he was upset about. This is what he was arguing against when he was talking about the philosophers. He wasn't talking about philosophy per se. He was talking about how the philosophers combined physical sciences with metaphysics. Okay, that's what he was really disputing the most. Anyway, so going back to this, so for example, they hated astrology for the most part. Orthodox Muslims did, so they got rid of this, and instead of because it was heretical, and as a result of that, they got rid of all this extra baggage. They were able to work with just the physical phenomena or the physical observations that were described therein, right? So they had to develop new models and things like this as a result.
Yeah.
So they say, well, the heretics are the ones who came up with all of these ideas. That's nonsensical, because it was Orthodox Islamic opinions that actually discarded all the nonsense within Greek science to begin with that allowed them to modify all these things. If the heretics had been the ones in control, they would have adopted astrology.
Yep.
And all this other nonsense that some of these scientists didn't care about. Huh?
Astronomy and astrology was the same thing at that time before the Muslims separated.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were a number of things and this is one of the things that, like I said, we'll get to Ghazali. When you hear about Orthodox Muslim theologians dealing with the philosophers, they were dealing explicitly on an abstract level of metaphysics. Okay, they didn't care about their scientific comprehension. So when Al-Ghazali says he's going against Aristotle or Aristotelian natural philosophy, he's speaking specifically about the metaphysical views therein. He's not talking about their physical observations, like astronomy. He would never dispute astronomy or mathematics or things like this. But back then, Greek philosophers or Aristotelian philosophers in general used to think those were the same things. You couldn't be a mathematician unless you believed in everything that Aristotle taught.
Yeah,
that's what they thought. And Ghazali was like, no, I can do 1 + 1 = 2 without having to believe in Aristotle's metaphysics.
Yeah.
So that was essentially the substance of his critique.
Yeah, and if we look into the centuries here, so one of the arguments that I think George Saliba makes is the peak of the Islamic sciences, especially in terms of astronomy, were basically after Ghazali. So, I mean,
oh yeah,
it's a very simple to show that.
The fascinating thing is that because Ghazali was he was successful at something, but he wasn't the only person to make these arguments. He was successful at demarcating between metaphysics and natural sciences to such an extent where it did influence some Muslim theologians in the future, but mostly the scientists, because now they weren't dealing with all these metaphysical assumptions. They could simply do whatever they wanted to. They could speculate about any of these models of the universe and just start, modifying whatever they felt like was necessary for them to get the job done. So they started making what we call instrumental models.
Yeah.
So they would look at these observations, and now they have all these assumptions are gone because they've been destroyed by Islamic theology, like because they're unorthodox. Now they're like, okay, well, let me think of something that's more in conformity with that. And so they looked at this data and they go, okay, well, here's a model that works and doesn't go against Islamic theology because it has nothing to say about it. And so you got Imam Kushti, for example, who was probably the first individual who was first scientist to come up with the idea that the Earth is not stationary, which is what helped Copernicus comprehend the heliocentric system.
Yep.
Or conceptualize it, right? So it was because of Muslim astronomers prior who got rid of all the Aristotelian baggage, as it were.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think this is a very good point to highlight, that Islam was acting like a sifting system. So it was taking out all of the elements which happened to be anti-Islamic and also happened to be irrational. I'm trying to remember a particular example. Alchemy and chemistry, right? So alchemy and chemistry was basically seen as the same thing at one point. And then I've forgotten the name of, probably you'd remember, one of these Muslim scientists who basically separated them and said, no, you have chemistry and you have this, alchemy thing, which is totally distinct.
I don't happen to recall the name at the moment because I didn't study the Muslim chemist in my analysis. However, I wouldn't be surprised because, as you say, it was Islamic orthodoxy was a sifting system. Okay,
Yeah.
It was filtering bad ideas out, but only metaphysically bad ideas, which were already cumbersome to scientific inquiry to begin with.
Yeah.
Because as people don't seem to realize, back then, science and philosophy were the exact same thing. Your philosophical ideas are what informed your scientific, like there was no such thing as, for example, methodological naturalism.
Yeah.
You only view things from the perspective of a physical reality. Whatever your contention with that methodology is, it was helpful for the Muslims that they did adopt it to some extent, because it's instrumental. It's instrumental in developing appropriate or approximate models of the universe for them to work with the data, right? But they still were very religious people.
Yep.
Right? So Orthodox Islam actually facilitated the Golden Age by getting rid of all of the nonsense that already burdened the sciences, Greek thought. Now, what's fascinating is what happened after this 17th century. Is why did Muslims start to become stagnant as a result?
Just before we